A brilliant flash tore through the twilight, a jagged streak of summer lightning, followed by a sharp electric crackle that sliced the air. Then a scream, raw and bone-chilling, ripped through our sleepy neighborhood. I bolted to the window, my glass of sweet tea nearly toppling in my rush, and caught sight of a woman in a powder-blue pantsuit thrashing at the top of our metal fence. Her body convulsed, a stark silhouette against the purpling sky, before she crashed backward onto our front lawn with a thud so heavy I felt it ripple through the floorboards. Her clipboard, that constant badge of her authority, hit the grass. With a dull clatter, papers fluttering in the evening breeze like chaotic confetti. From where I stood, I could see faint tendrils of smoke curling from her fingertips as she lay still, the moment stretching into an agonizing eternity, though it was likely just seconds. The sharp, acrid stench of singed hair and scorched fabric drifted through my open window, mingling with the sweet magnolia blooms Grandpa had planted for Grandma on their 30th anniversary. Then came a low, pained groan, followed by a string of slurred curses that sharpened as she came to, her voice rising with every word. The creak of our rusty screen door broke the spell. Grandpa stepped onto the porch, his gnarled hand wrapped around his old Remington shotgun, the same one he'd carried through Vietnam's rice paddies, his eyes narrowed and ready. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you have any confrontation with the HOA. We will narrate your story on our channel. The other, holding what looked like a small black remote control that he'd fashioned from parts ordered through a catalogue. His posture was relaxed but alert, the stance of a man who had seen far worse than an entitled woman suffering the consequences of her own actions. His voice was steady, almost casual, as he called out to the woman still sprawled across our lawn, her designer pantsuit now stained with grass and dirt. "Told you not to touch my fence, Karen." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The neighbors who had gathered at the commotion, the Johnsons from across the street, old Mrs. Abernathy with her evening shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and several others I didn't recognize as well, quickly dispersed, eyes averted, conversation suddenly hushed. And from that moment forward, no one in our neighborhood ever questioned Grandpa again. It all started when Whispering Pines, our quiet, rural community where my family had lived for 4 generations, became the target of revitalization. What that really meant was wealthy city folks buying up farmland, building cookie-cutter houses with names like the Lexington and the Windsor, and eventually forming a homeowners association to preserve property values, a phrase that would soon become the bane of our existence. Our little corner of the county had once been a place where neighbors knew each other's business but minded their own, where handshake agreements meant more than written contracts, and where the worst offense you could commit was not waving when passing someone on the road. All that changed when the developers arrived with their bulldozers and architectural renderings, promising a new era of prosperity for what they called an underutilized agricultural zone. Our home sat on 10 acres of land that my great-grandfather had purchased after returning from World War II, determined to create a place where he could raise his family away from the noise and complications of city life. The old man had worked the midnight shift at the steel mill for 30 years to pay off that land, my grandpa used to tell me, and he'd sooner have cut off his right arm than sell a single acre. We had an old farmhouse with a red tin roof that had certainly seen better days. The paint peeled in places, and certain floorboards had a distinctive creak that served as an early warning system for kids trying to sneak in past curfew. But it was our home, filled with history and memories that no homeowners association could possibly understand or appreciate. We raised chickens that sometimes wandered where they shouldn't, grew vegetables in a garden that sprawled rather than conforming to tidy rows, and kept my brother's old tree house in the oak tree out front even though he'd long outgrown it. To the newcomers, we were an eyesore. To ourselves, we were just living the way we always had, the way that made sense to us. Grandpa, who had served in Vietnam and returned with both physical and invisible scars, had fortified the property years ago with a custom steel fence he designed and welded himself in the old barn that had once housed dairy cows, but now served as his workshop. The fence wasn't for keeping people out originally. It was to give Grandpa a sense of security during those dark nights when the memories came back too strong, and he needed to know exactly where his territory began and ended. It wasn't pretty by suburban standards. 8 tall with decorative but sharp finials along the top that Grandpa had modelled after the French Quarter, ironwork he had admired during a rare vacation to New Orleans with Grandma before her passing. Some of our newer neighbours had complained that it looked militaristic or unwelcoming, but we knew it was just another of Grandpa's ways of imposing order on a world that had seldom made sense to him after what he'd seen overseas. The fence had never been electrified, at least not until Karen Williams moved into the neighborhood and was promptly elected as Homeowners Association president by a coalition of newcomers who outnumbered the original residents 3-1. Heron was everything you might expect. Freshly highlighted blonde bob that never moved even in the strongest breeze. Designer sunglasses perched on her head, even on cloudy days as if permanently attached. A collection of pastel-colored pantsuits for every day of the week, and an air of authority that she wielded like a weapon. She drove a white Lexus Sport utility vehicle with a vanity plate that read KRNSLA. A joke, I suppose, though no one had ever seen her laugh at anything except perhaps the discomfort of others. From day one, she made it clear that our property was an eyesore that needed immediate attention. "Don't you care about your neighbor's property values?" became her constant refrain, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes and a tilt of her head that suggested she was speaking to particularly slow children rather than adults who had owned their property since before she was born. The first official notice arrived just 2 weeks after the Homeowners Association formation, delivered not by mail but by Karen herself, who stood on our porch with a manila envelope clutched in her manicured fingers like it contained state secrets. The document inside cited 15 separate violations from our non-regulation mailbox, a hand-painted one my little sister had decorated with sunflowers for Grandpa's birthday, to the unauthorized agricultural equip visible from the road. That agricultural equipment was Grandpa's restored 1948 John Deere tractor that he had painstakingly brought back to life over 3 summers, sourcing parts from as far away as Nebraska and repainting it the original green and yellow himself. When my father politely explained that our property was grandfathered in and exempt from the new regulations according to county ordinances, Karen simply smiled a tight-lipped smile that resembled nothing so much as a paper cut, and said, "We would see about that." The threat was clear, even if her tone remained artificially pleasant. The harassment started small. Daily drive-bys with Karen taking photos from her white Lexus Sport utility vehicle, carefully documenting every blade of grass that grew too tall or every fleck of paint that dared to peel from our barn. She would slow down to a crawl as she passed our driveway, her camera lens poking out the window like the barrel of a gun, clicking away as if each snapshot was another bullet in her arsenal. My little brother took to making faces at her from behind the bushes until Mum caught him and explained that antagonizing Mrs. Williams would only make things worse. But she started it, he protested, with the simple logic of a 9-year-old. Mum couldn't really argue with that. Then came the friendly drop-ins, where Karen would knock on our door with pamphlets about neighborhood beautification and community standards. The glossy brochures showed row after row of identical homes with identical landscaping, a dystopian vision of suburban perfection that made my skin crawl. My mother, ever the diplomat who had spent 20 years as a kindergarten teacher, managing much more reasonable tiny tyrants, would accept them with a forced smile, while Grandpa would mutter something about constitutional rights and cold dead hands from his recliner in the living room. Just loud enough for Karen to hear, but not quite loud enough for her to directly address. But things escalated when we caught Karen actually inside our property line, measuring the distance between our fence and the road with a bright yellow tape measure that seemed to extend forever from her hands like some bizarre yellow snake. It was a Sunday morning, and we were just returning from church, still dressed in our Sunday best, when we spotted her distinctive white Lexus parked at the end of our driveway. She had simply opened our gate, which was closed but not locked, because that's how things had always been done in our part of the country, and walked in as if she owned the place. She wore white pants that day, a choice that seemed particularly foolish for someone trespassing on a working farm with free-range chickens, and her measuring tape was stretched from the base of our fence to a point she had determined was the proper boundary of our property. My father, normally the most event-empered man I had ever known, who coached Little League and taught Sunday school with equal patience, stopped the car abruptly and was out the door before my mother could even reach for her seatbelt. He confronted Karen, his voice raised enough that I could hear it through the car windows, asking what she thought she was doing on private property without so much as a courtesy call in advance. Karen's response was chilling in its entitlement, delivered with the confident condescension of someone who had never been told no in her entire adult life. As Homeowners Association president, I have inspection rights to ensure compliance. This fence is 6 in closer to the road than regulation allows. Section 4, paragraph 12 of the bylaws clearly states that all structures must be set back at least 20 ft from the public right of way. She tapped her clipboard for emphasis, as if the mere existence of a document she had helped draft somehow superseded state and federal law regarding private property. That was the first time Grandpa directly addressed Karen. He had been watching from the porch, silently rocking in his chair, as he often did on Sunday mornings. But her words brought him to his feet with a speed that belied his 72 years and arthritic knees. He didn't rush or make any sudden movements. Grandpa never did. After Vietnam, explaining once that in the jungle the man who moved too quickly was often the first to die. But there was a deliberate purpose to his movements as he descended the worn wooden steps of our porch, the boards creaking under his weight in that familiar pattern that I could recognize blindfolded. He walked down the gravel path toward where Karen and my father stood facing each other, taking the deliberate, measured pace of a man who had seen too much in his 72 years to be hurried by anyone, especially not someone who thought a clipboard conferred authority. He was still wearing his church clothes, pressed khakis and a blue button-down shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with the lean muscle of a lifetime of physical labor. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his face was freshly shaved. But there was something in his eyes that morning that made me shiver despite the warm spring air. It was the look my mother called his thousand-y stare, the one that appeared when the past and present seemed to blur for him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that only comes from genuine experience rather than self-appointed titles. "This is private property. You are trespass. I'm asking you politely to leave now and not return without an invitation." He didn't raise his voice. Grandpa never needed to, but there was a stillness to him as he spoke that reminded me of the moments before a summer storm when the air grows heavy and the birds fall silent. Karen looked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rising toward her hairline in a practiced expression of disbelief. Then she laughed. Actually laughed in his face, a brittle sound like breaking glass that contained no genuine mirth whatsoever. Her hand came to rest on her hip, in a posture of smug certainty, as she replied, "Sir, perhaps you don't understand how a homeowners association works. This isn't 1970 anymore. We have standards now, codes that everyone must follow for the good of the community. When you chose to live in this neighborhood..." Grandpa cut her off with a raised hand, not rudely, but firmly, the way he used to silence us kids when we were being particularly obtuse about something important. "Miss Williams," he said, using her name for the first time. "My family didn't choose. This neighborhood chose us about 50 years before you ever laid eyes on it. My father built that house you're so eager to criticize. I built this fence with my own 2 hands when you were still playing with dolls, and the county records will show that our property is exempt from your association's rules under the grandfather clause of the municipal code." Karen's smile faltered, just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Your fence violates Code 6.4 of the Homeowners Association bylaws. You have 30 days to remove it or face fines of $100 per day. After 90 days of non-compliance, the association has the right to place a lien on your property." She delivered this threat with the same tone someone might use to recite a grocery list. But there was an undeniable gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. Grandpa didn't raise his voice, didn't even change his expression beyond a slight narrowing of his eyes. He simply said, "I wouldn't come back if I were you." 4 words spoken so quietly, I had strained to hear them from where I stood by the car, but they carried a weight that seemed to momentarily pierce even Karen's armor of self-righteousness. For just a second, something like uncertainty flickered across her fate, but it passed quickly, replaced by her default expression of smug superiority. She scoffed, turned on her heel with military precision, and walked away, her white pants, miraculously, still pristine despite her trespassing adventure. Her phone already at her ear as she called someone to report this hostile interaction. As she reached her Lexus, she called back over her shoulder, "Expect formal notice from our attorney." Grandpa said nothing in response, just watched her go with the impassive patience of a man who had learned long ago that some battles are won by waiting rather than charging head-on. The official Homeowners Association letter arrived 3 days later. Certified mail with return res requested, as if we were being served with court documents rather than the petty threats of a neighborhood organization with delusions of governmental authority. The envelope was heavy cream-colored stock with the newly designed Homeowners Association logo embossed on the front. A stylized pine tree inside a perfect circle meant to evoke the natural beauty of the area while simultaneously controlling and containing it. It was addressed to property owner rather than to my father or grandpa by name. A small but deliberate slight that didn't go unnoticed. The document inside, printed on matching cream letterhead, detailed all of our supposed violations, with our fence being the primary offender. The language was dense with legal terminology, clearly drafted by someone with at least a semester of pre-law under their belt, who enjoyed using phrases like "pursuant to" and "in accordance with" to make their demands sound more official than they actually were. Structures must conform to approved Homeowners Association designs, materials, and placement. Your current security fence must be removed within 30 days of this notice. Failure to comply will result in daily fines, as outlined in the enclosed schedule of penalties. There was also a handwritten note in the margin in what I recognized as Karen's precise teacher-like script. "This is non-negotiable." My parents were worried. My father sat at the kitchen table that evening, calculator in hand, trying to determine if we could afford the potential fines, while simultaneously consulting with a lawyer about fighting them. Legal battles cost money we didn't have. With my sister's college tuition already stretching our finances to the breaking point, and fighting an entire homeowners association seemed like a losing battle, the new residents outnumbered the old ones, and they all seemed to share Karen's vision of a perfectly uniformed community where individual expression was subordinated to property values and curb appeal. But Grandpa remained strangely calm, almost serene in the face of the threat. He read through the letter once, snorted softly at the handwritten note, then folded it neatly and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "Don't you worry about this nonsense," he told my father. "I've faced worse than a woman with a clipboard and delusions of grandeur." That evening, I noticed the light in his workshop staying on much later than usual, the warm yellow glow spilling from the windows of the old barn where he spent most of his time these days. When I brought him a cup of coffee around midnight, as was our ritual whenever he worked late, me unable to sleep, him unable to stop working once he'd started a project, I found him hunched over his workbench, surrounded by wiring diagrams, electrical components, and his old engineering textbooks from his days working for the power company before retirement. Schematics and sketches were tacked to the walls, and a collection of tools I didn't recognize were laid out in precise rows on his secondary workbench. "What are you working on, Grandpa?" I asked, setting the steaming mug beside him on a coaster. He was always particular about not leaving rings on his wooden workbench. He looked up at me over the reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Just making some improvements to the property," he said with a wink that made me both curious and slightly nervous. There was a gleam in his eye that I recognized from past projects. The time he built a potato cannon that could launch spuds clear across our backfield, or the summer he constructed a homemade weather station that was more accurate than the local news. It was the look of a man with a plan. And in my experience, Grandpa's plans tended to be either brilliant or slightly terrifying, often both. Over the next week, Grandpa spent most of his time working on what he called his security upgrade. He installed a series of small solar panels on the roof of his workshop, connected to what looked like car batteries stored in weatherproof containers. I helped him run insulated wiring along the inside of our fence, carefully hidden from view. When I asked what voltage he was planning to run through the fence, he patted my shoulder reassuringly. "Nothing lethal, child, just enough to deliver a message." 24 volts. It'll hurt like the dickens, but it won't do any permanent damage unless someone has a heart condition they aren't aware of. He also installed small warning signs every 30 FT along the fence line that read, "Warning, security fence, no trespassing." They weren't large or particularly noticeable unless you were looking for them, but they were there. His legal protection, he explained. The final touch was a series of motion-activated trail cameras positioned to cover every angle of the property, feeding to a monitor in Grandpa's bedroom and recording to a hard drive hidden in the attic. After the installation was complete, he showed me a small remote control. "This is the activator," he explained. "The fence isn't live all the time. That would be dangerous for the wildlife and the neighbor kids. But this button here will send power to any section where the motion sensors detect someone trying to climb over. The bottom 6 feet are never electrified, just the top 2 feet with those decorative points." When I expressed concern about the legality of his security upgrade, Grandpa showed me a dog-eared copy of our county's property defense laws. Perfectly legal in this county to defend your property with reasonable measures against repeated trespassers. I've documented every instance of that woman coming onto our land uninvited. We've given verbal warnings, we've posted signs. What happens next is on her, not us. For nearly 2 weeks, our property remained Karen-y. The letters kept coming, each more threatening than the last. But she didn't physically appear. We began to hope that perhaps she had taken Grandpa's warning seriously. That hope evaporated on a Saturday afternoon when we were all away from the house attending my little brother's baseball game, all except Grandpa, who had stayed home complaining of knee pain. We later learned from the security footage what happened in our absence. Karen arrived with two other homeowners association board members, clipboard in hand, and marched directly to our gate. Finding it locked, she announced to her companions, "This is ridiculous. They can't lock us out. We have covenant enforcement rights." When one of the other board members pointed to the warning sign and suggested perhaps they should call their attorney first, Karen dismissed him with a wave of her hand. "I'm not afraid of some old veteran's scare tactics. He's bluffing about the fence being electric. I'm going to document these violations once and for all." The footage showed Karen handing her clipboard to one of her companions, grabbing the fence with both hands and beginning to climb. She made it about halfway up when she noticed Grandpa standing on the porch watching her. She paused momentarily, then called out something the camera's microphone didn't quite catch. Grandpa responded clearly, "Mom, that fence is electrified. Please come down before you hurt yourself." Karen laughed loud enough for the camera to pick up and continued climbing. She had just reached the decorative finials at the top when Grandpa raised the remote control. He gave her one last warning. "This is your final chance to respect private property." Karen had just swung one leg over the top of the fence, straddling it as she prepared to descend into our yard. When Grandpa pressed the button, the cameras caught everything. The sudden stiffening of her body, the look of shock that transformed her face, and the involuntary muscle spasms that caused her to lose her grip and tumble backward onto the grass. By the time we returned home from the baseball game, there was already a police car in our driveway. My heart sank, thinking Grandpa was being arrested. Instead, we found him calmly sitting at the kitchen table, showing the officer the security footage while Karen sat ice-packing her right hand in our living room, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "I want him arrested for assault," she was demanding as we walked in. To cut me, the officer, a middle-aged man who had known our family for years, turned to us with a look that was more apologetic than concerned. "I'm just taking statements right now. Ms. Williams here claimed she was deliberately injured while performing homeowners association duties." My father started to speak, but Grandpa raised his hand. "Show him the whole footage from the beginning." The officer turned back to Grandpa's laptop, where the security video clearly showed Karen ignoring the warning signs, dismissing her colleagues' concerns, and climbing our fence despite Grandpa's verbal warnings. When the video ended, the officer closed the laptop and turned to Karen. "Mom, based on what I've seen, you were trespassing on clearly marked private property after being verbally warned multiple times. The electrical current was activated only after you ignored both posted and verbal warnings. I don't see grounds for assault charges here." Karen's face flushed an alarming shade of red. "You don't understand. The Homeowners Association has inspection rights. We have bylaw." The officer shook his head. "Homeowners Association bylaws don't supersede county trespassing laws, ma'am, and they certainly don't give you the right to climb someone's security fence after being expressly told not to." As if to punctuate his statement, he pulled out his notebook and began writing. "I am, however, going to document this trespassing incident. Another occurrence could result in criminal charges against you. Heron left our property that day in a state of barely contained fury. But the real fallout was just beginning. By nightfall, someone we never discovered who had uploaded a trimmed version of our security footage to the neighborhood social media group. It showed Karen's fence-climbing adventure, her dismissal of warnings, and her rather spectacular fall in all its glory. By morning, it had been shared widely throughout the community, with neighbors we'd never even met coming to our defense in the comments section. "She tried to do the same thing to us," wrote one family. "She enters yards without permission all the time," commented another. The video became a catalyst for people to share their own Karen stories. And suddenly, the woman who had wielded the Homeowners Association like a personal thief found herself facing a community in revolt. 3 days after the incident, we received a letter from an attorney representing Karen threatening a lawsuit for malicious injury and intentional infliction of emotional distress. My parents were worried sick. We couldn't afford a lengthy legal battle, but Grandpa remained unruffled. "Let her try," he said, sipping his coffee as if we were discussing the weather instead of potential financial ruin. The next day, he visited his old friend, Judge Harmon, who had retired from the bench but still practiced law part-time. They spent hours reviewing the footage, the Homeowners Association bylaws, and our county's property defense statutes. When Grandpa returned, he was smiling. "Judge says we're on solid legal ground. He's agreed to represent us pro bono if it comes to that." He also made a few calls to some buddies at the county clerk's office. Those calls proved significant. Within a week, Karen received formal notice that the county was investigating her for potential harassment and repeated trespassing. Additionally, the Sheriff's Department issued an official statement clarifying that in our county, defensive electrification of private property was perfectly legal as long as warning signs were posted and the voltage was below certain thresholds, both conditions that Grandpa had carefully met. The final blow came when someone anonymously sent the Homeowners Association board copies of text messages Karen had sent to various friends, explicitly stating her intention to provoke Grandpa into some kind of confrontation. "I'm going to push that old man until he does something that gives us grounds to force compliance," she had written. "These holdout properties are bringing down everyone's home values. The evidence of her premeditated harassment was damning." An emergency homeowners association meeting was called, which we attended along with nearly every homeowner in the community. Karen arrived with her arm dramatically wrapped in an ACE bandage, though the doctor's report had clearly stated she suffered nothing more than minor electrical burns to her palms. She attempted to frame herself as a victim, fighting for neighborhood standards against an obstinate and dangerous old man. But as neighbor after neighbor stood to share their own experiences with her overreach and intimidation tactics, the tide visibly turned. The final speaker was Mrs. Abernathy, an 80-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood even longer than our family. "I've been here 60 years, she said in a wavering voice, "and never once needed someone to tell me what color my mailbox should be. Shame on you, Karen Williams." The vote that followed was nearly unanimous. Karen was removed from the Homeowners Association presidency, effective immediately, and a motion was passed to review and potentially scale back many of the more restrictive covenant requirements. Karen's civil suit never materialized. Her attorney quietly withdrew after reviewing the full evidence package Judge Harmon had prepared, which included not only the video footage and text messages, but affidavit from 17 different homeowners, attesting to Karen's pattern of unauthorized property entries. The Sheriff's Department officially closed their investigation with a formal warning to Karen about trespassing, but no charges were filed against either party. The county building inspector came out to review Grandpa's electrical fence setup, and after a thorough examination, declared it within code for agricultural security purposes and issued the proper permits retroactively. The matter was, legally speaking, resolved. The morning after the Homeowners Association meeting, Grandpa installed new, larger signs along our fence line, warning live fence. Trespassers will be educated. He sat on the porch that evening, shotgun across his lap, more from habit than necessity, sipping his coffee and watching the sunset with a satisfaction I hadn't seen in him for years. Neighbors who had previously avoided our eyesore property now drove by slowly, waving respectfully to Grandpa as they passed. Some even stopped to chat, sharing their own frustrations with how the neighborhood had changed and expressing admiration for his stand against overreach. One young father brought his son over specifically to shake Grandpa's hand, telling the boy, "This is what standing up for your rights looks like." As for Karen, she stopped her daily drive-bys completely. Her white Lexus was notably absent from our road, and rumors circulated that she had started house hunting in a different community altogether. 2 weeks after what people in the neighborhood now referred to simply as the incident, a Ferrari sign appeared in front of her pristine colonial with its perfectly manicured lawn. She held one open house, which was sparsely attended, then accepted an offer well below asking price. The moving trucks came on a Saturday morning, loaded up her furniture, and by afternoon, Karen Williams was gone from Whispering Pines. As the truck pulled away, I noticed Grandpa watching from our porch, his expression neither triumphant nor angry, just quietly satisfied. "Some folks just need to learn where the boundaries are," he said, more to himself than to me. "And some lessons stick better than others." The week after Karen left, a strange thing happened. The acting Homeowners Association president, Mr. Chen from down the road, stopped by our house. Instead of bringing violation notices or demands, he came with a proposal. Would Grandpa be willing to serve as a consultant on the revised Homeowners Association bylaws? They wanted someone with practical experience in property rights to help strike a balance between community standards and individual freedom. Grandpa considered the offer for all of 5 seconds before declining with a chuckle. "I'm not much of a committee man," he told Mr. Chen, "but I'm happy to look over whatever you come up with and tell you if it passes the common sense test." Mr. Chen seemed satisfied with this arrangement and left with a respectful nod to Grandpa that would have been unimaginable just a month earlier. Our fence remains standing to this day. Its steel posts and sharp finials, a reminder of boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. Grandpa still activates the electric system occasionally, mostly when we're away from home for extended periods, though no one has tested it since Karen's dramatic demonstration. The neighborhood has settled into a new normal, less restrictive, more respectful of long-time residents. We've even noticed some of the newer homes beginning to show touches of individuality. A wind chime here, an unapproved garden sculpture there, small rebellions against rigid conformity. As for Grandpa, he's become something of a local legend. People still slow down when they pass our house, pointing out the electric fence to visitors with a mixture of awe and amusement. I overheard one neighbor tell another, "That's the place with the fence that fried the Homeowners Association lady." The story grows with each telling, of course. In some versions, Karen was launched 10 FT into the air. In others, her hair turned completely white from the shock. Grandpa just smiles at these exaggerations and says nothing to correct them. "A little healthy fear keeps people honest," he told me once. And sometimes fence isn't just to keep people out. It's to remind them to ask before they enter. I've noticed that on clear evenings when the sun is setting and casting long shadows, across our property Grandpa often sits on the porch with a distant look in his eyes. Sometimes I sit with him, neither of us speaking, just watching the day end together. On one such evening, I finally asked him if he felt bad about what happened to Karen. He took a long time to answer, methodically tamping tobacco into his pipe and lighting it before replying. "I don't take pleasure in anyone's pain," he said finally, puffs of smoke punctuating his words. "But I don't regret defending what's ours. Some folks go through life thinking rules are just for other people. Eventually, they touch off a fence and learn differently." He reached over and patted my hand, his callous palm rough against my skin. "Remember that, child. Respecting boundaries, that's the foundation of any community worth having." As darkness settled over our property, the solar lights along our fence line blinked on one by one, tracing the perimeter of our land in a gentle glow. Somewhere in the distance, there was the faint sound of sizzling. Just our old porch light attracting moths. But I noticed Grandpa smile slightly at the sound. The fence stood silently in the gathering darkness, no longer just a barrier, but a statement. This far, no further. And in our quiet rural neighborhood, now a little less under the homeowners association thumb, no one questioned Grandpa.